The wife returns. In a small, peaceful village, Vu and Lan were once the embodiment of eternal love. They had been sweethearts since childhood, enduring many years together before finally becoming husband and wife. Lan, a gentle woman, was always kind and hardworking. Vu, handsome and rugged, had grown increasingly distant, his eyes now carrying a cold, unfamiliar gleam. Though he treated Lan kindly on the surface, the flame of love in his heart had long since extinguished. Everything began to change when Hun, a mysterious woman with irresistible charm, entered Vu's life. Hun was unlike Lan. She brought a breath of fresh air, a wave of intoxicating passion that Vu had never felt in his marriage. Hun was temptation personified, and Vu couldn't resist. Their secret meetings, whispered confessions in the dead of night, soon consumed the last remnants of love Vu had for his unsuspecting wife. At first, Vu intended for Hun to remain nothing more than a hidden affair, but their illicit love quickly turned into an insatiable desire. Lan became a burden, a meaningless presence standing in the way of his new life with Hun. Vu's mind twisted with dark thoughts, and soon, a cruel plan began to form. On that fateful night, a heavy rain fell. The wind howled through the trees, thunder rolling ominously across the sky as if nature itself was warning of the disaster to come. Vu suggested they take a walk by the riverbank, the place where they had once made their vows of eternal love. Naive, Lan believed him, thinking her husband wanted to do something romantic. She still trusted in their love, unaware that Vu had already sentenced her to death. As they stood by the river, Vu positioned himself behind Lan, his eyes cold and calculating. The rain poured down like a relentless drumbeat from the heavens. Without hesitation, he shoved her forcefully into the dark, raging water below. Lan barely had time to scream, only managing a look of terror as she locked eyes with her husband. Her hands clawed desperately at the muddy bank, but it was futile. The river consumed her, pulling her under until all that remained was silence. Vu stood there, staring at the black sky, his heart as cold and empty as the river. It's over. I'm free, he thought to himself. Time passed, and Vu and Hun officially began their life together. The once warm home he had shared with Lan now housed the guilty pair. At first, everything seemed perfect. But gradually, Lan's presence began creeping back into Vu's life. He could feel her cold, invisible touch whenever he came home. The wind would whistle eerily through the windows, floorboards would creak at odd hours, and sometimes in the dead of night, he swore he could hear the soft sound of a woman sighing. One night, Vu had a dream that took him back to the river where he had killed Lan. Under the pale light of the moon, she rose from the depths, her black hair matted with mud, her face ghostly white, her eyes filled with vengeance. She said nothing, simply walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. In his nightmare, Vu was paralyzed, unable to move. The closer Lan came, the more the air around him grew icy. As she reached out toward him, she whispered in a voice colder than death itself, "Did you really think you could escape me?" Vu awoke with a scream, drenched in sweat, his heart racing in his chest. He tried to calm himself, but the nightmare clung to him like a shadow. Every night after that, he feared sleep, for each time he closed his eyes, Lan would return, her hair wild, her eyes dead, her voice echoing in his mind. The strange occurrences in the house grew more frequent. Hun started hearing footsteps in the middle of the night, faint noises that sent chills down her spine. One evening, while Vu was sitting alone in the dark, he felt someone standing behind him. He turned slowly, and there she was, Lan, soaked and pale, her eyes glowing red with hatred. She stared at him, emotionless, and whispered in a chilling tone, "You will pay." Vu screamed and stumbled backward, scrambling to escape, but the room seemed to warp and twist, the walls closing in around him. Lan took one slow, deliberate step after another, her hands reaching out for him. He could feel her icy grip tightening around his throat. He thrashed wildly, but the more he fought, the stronger her grip became. His vision blurred, his breath cut short as his life slipped away in sheer terror. The next morning, Hun found Vu lying dead in their bed, his eyes wide open in horror, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. Around his neck were dark, bruising marks as if someone had strangled him. No one could explain what had happened, but from that day on, the house fell into disrepair, abandoned by all. Whenever the rains came, villagers claimed they could still hear the eerie sounds of footsteps and the ghostly wails of sorrow echoing from the house. And for those brave enough to approach, a woman's voice could be heard, whispering softly into the wind. Did you really think you could escape me?